Hello, welcome back to the channel. So this is another video in my series talking about Vampire the Rivals, the card game. What I'm doing is looking at the lore behind the cards, linking it as closely as I can as to possible. You won't get a massive deep dive in lore, which will go on for hours. There's loads of good resources out there. A podcast I would recommend, for example, is 25 Years of Vampire the Masquerade, if you're wanting to get a real deep dive. But what we'll be doing is talking about the cards, talking about what they represent, and maybe talking about how you'll see further cards get developed in the future. So today we're going to be talking about the traditions, and this is a sister video that goes alongside the titles video I did. To understand the traditions and titles, it will help you understand the society that the vampires live in. And the biggest main society that we talk about is the Camarilla. And certainly Camarilla has princes. So the traditions are the rules that every Camarilla vampire must follow. A prince could have whatever local rules wanted above and beyond the traditions. However, the 6 traditions are written in stone, and every vampire is expected to obey them and be seen to obey them. If you want to really cause strife for a rival, you would find evidence of them playing roughshod on the traditions, and that could not easily be ignored. Whilst we have a written version of them, and I'll introduce each section with the written version of it from the rulebook, there's often some local variations, maybe in language or language or choice of words. However, the intent is always the same. Some say these are the traditions handed down from Cain to his children. However, they were widely accepted as a Camarilla was formed after the end of the Anarch Revolt, and versions of these existed before in the Dark Ages with slightly different weighting and slightly different writing and emphasis. In modern nights, they're the bedrock upon which vampire society is based upon. Even the Anarchs would have something similar like these, though they definitely would be called something different. And even the Sabbat understands at times the value of what they would call a non-disclosure pact, but actually essentially is a masquerade. It is always a Camarilla vampire's choice to follow them or not. To disobey them, however, would leave a vampire outcast and pariah at best and blood-hunted and slain at worst. I always say understanding the traditions is understanding the society that exists for vampires. Occasionally might make a right, but vampire society is very precious about their traditions. I will cover each of the 6 traditions, cover the cards we already have, and speculate on the cards we may see. So far we have 3 tradition cards, and all 3 are ongoing actions. The 4th one we're going to see, which will come out soon, is a scheme. And that is the 6th tradition, the destruction. So the first tradition. Thou shalt not reveal thy true nature to those not of the blood. Doing so shall renounce thy claims of blood. This is the most important tradition. It is so important. The first tradition, the Masquerade, the whole game line is called after it. Vampire the Masquerade. It's also really simple. The existence of vampires must be kept from mortal people. Violation of this tradition is a more serious offence a vampire can commit. Vampires are powerful and have influence, yes, but the First Inquisition taught them that they can't stand against the mass of humanity. The First Inquisition, during the High Dark Ages, Middle Ages, was the Inquisition of the Church bandying around, uncovering vampires and burning them out the havens. Breach of this tradition will risk one's own destruction and the destruction of all kindred, and that is why the Anarchs and the Sabbat will even consider the Masquerade at times. Certainly in the modern game, we are in the dawn of the Second Inquisition. The Church, with mortal governments, have become more organised and are hunting down vampires. Certainly they're not allowing that knowledge to get out to the public at large and create the chaos that would entail. However, they are actively hunting down and slaying vampires. The card. Pay 2 prestige. Vampires outside your haven have +1 secrecy. Then if you burn 2 mortals, burn this card. Perfect. While masquerading vampires are hard at the spot, as you'd expect, and the defeating immortals weakens a masquerade. The more retainers and agents you have on your side, the more likely someone will leak. It's worth noting the art. Masquerading with masquerade masks. Certainly in vampire games, live action role-playing especially, masked balls were always popular. I know domains that would host one every year. In my live role-playing, I was involved in an organisation called Camarilla UK, and we had I think at its peak, about 30 games around the UK, and you could travel your character around and visit all those games and interact with the politicking games as much as you want. And mask balls were always really popular. So yes, first tradition, the masquerade. Second tradition, the domain. Thy domain is thy own concern. All others owe thee respect whilst in it. None may challenge thy word while in thy domain. The tradition of the domain has seen an evolution as vampires have moved into the cities from the countryside. That's followed generally the populations that they prey upon. As we've gone from a rural to an urban existence, vampires, after all, will follow their food. Now the domain is used as a justification for the prince to rule a city. The prince is then able to hand out parcels of territory in a feudal manner to those under them. This tradition has always been part and parcel of the eldest ruling vampiric society. Your acknowledged haven and its surround are also considered to be your domain. Sometimes this may be like areas like a park or sewers, or perhaps defined streets. For example, Stowe Manor, the Bruges, has a 5 blocks south of Nelson and 42nd Street. Card is a pretty clever design. Again, it is creating a cost for doing something. In a vampire society, everything has a cost. I'm looking at this card thinking that the mortals are in your domain and your opponents are having to pay you off to be able to attack them. It's a clever workaround representing a lack of physical territory in the game, with the streets being a sort of just a zone, but not a physical representation of a specific zone. Third tradition. Actually, again, the artwork is the vampire clawing at the domain. Imagine that would be a good piece of artwork for a prince of a city as well. Third tradition, the progeny. Thou shalt only sire another with the permission of thine elder. If thou create another without thine elder's leave, both thou and thy progeny shall be slain. The progeny, the creation and siring of another vampire. To create a vampire only needs to drain a mortal to the point of death and then feed them some of their own blood. So it's actually fairly easy to create a vampire. So with the progeny, this is to do with the princes controlling who gets to sire and create vampires. It's a right of the princes, and they position themselves to be the eldest in the case of this tradition. So whenever tradition talks about the eldest, it will always be referring to the person, vampire, with the title prince. It is a right that is strictly controlled. Together with domain, they're the most important rewards a prince can give out. A prince who fails to maintain domain, or a prince that fails to maintain progeny, is setting himself up for a world of hate as vampires just erode their power. With the masquerade being so important, this is something that a vampire society also wants to keep under wraps. Too many vampires and the threat of discovery increases. So again, in a clever piece of card design, this becomes about limiting the numbers of vampires out in the game and punishing wide plays rather than the act of creating a vampire. I see this as a simple: the more vampires there are out in play, the more resources are required to stop the masquerade from tearing, especially when you've got those second Inquisition agents on the street. Now we get into the cards, the traditions that don't have cards. The fourth tradition, the accounting. Those thou create are thine own children. Until thy progeny shall be released, thou shalt command them in all things. Their sins are thine to endure. The accounting on the face of it is simple. A sire is responsible for those that create until a prince acknowledges them into society. With all things, this is a double-edged weapon for the vampire world. The child becomes a vulnerable part of a vampire's defences. Even after released, certain clans hold the lineages to account for their actions. I'm looking at you, Clan Ventry. Prince can also choose not to acknowledge a child and is under no obligation to do so, in which case exile will be the only path available unless the sire would be always responsible for them. And exile in the vampire world is often death sentence. I've spoke before that the cities are gilded cages and travel between cities is difficult at best. This is also another tradition that reinforces the rule of the elders in society. Not only do you need permission, you need to be strong enough to protect your child. As convention dictates, any may kill or feed from it. There isn't a card for this tradition, as I said before. The elements I would want to build into this card would be higher BP vampires will get a bonus or be able to do something against lower BP vampires. So perhaps grant a targeted attack. Another option would be something to do with a consanguineous, which is a fancy word for clan-based, effect. If an opponent has a number of vampires of the same clan, exhaust the weakest, perhaps. As maybe as a scheme action. Fifth tradition, the hospitality. Honour one another's domain. When thou comes to a foreign city, thou shalt present thyself to one who ruleth there. Without the word of acceptance, thou art nothing. This reinforces a prince's power. Without hospitality within a domain, acceptance if you will, you have no right to be there. Whilst powerful vampires may ignore the tradition and the domain unable to remove them, any of the court who has been known to do business with them would see their status and standing marked down. Where would I see this design space getting filled? Perhaps an ongoing effect to make recruiting vampires harder. Maybe it's costing an extra prestige, representing the loopholes that you have to jump through to get the prince on side so that vampire can be seen in society, joining your coterie and working with your chosen vampires. The sixth tradition, the destruction. So this card is coming out with the Shadows and Shrouds. Thou art forbidden to destroy another of thy kind. The right of destruction belongeth only to thine elder. Only the eldest amongst thee shall call a blood hunt. This is another tradition that has been moved to the prince being the eldest in the domain. In a society ruled by beasts within, this keeps society together and functioning on a civil level. It's the ultimate sanction held by the prince, a monopoly on death. We see a card that will be our scheme and doing aggravated damage that scales on how much influence the scheme passed by. And aggravated damage is one way to permanently remove a vampire to meet final death. It's worth noting another element of the traditions, which hopefully will see some sort of card support, is Laxtalionis or blood hunts. The prince can give whatever punishments they feel is fitting for breaching the traditions. Of course, how the prince is seen to rule is a key part of the eternal struggle with the other elders in the domain. However, a prince can call Lex Talionis, which is the eye for an eye, or a blood hunt in the modern language. In the blood hunt, a vampire is physically hunted across a city. They are persona non grata, and all in the city are compelled to hunt them. Aiding them is a crime. During a blood hunt, the blood of the vampire can be reclaimed and diablerie permitted. Perhaps we could see a blood hunt card which would set a vampire secrecy to 0, meaning they would always be considered on their own. Maybe that could be a scheme. Should a vampire's secrecy be set to 0, and then they would always be considered out with a coterie. So finally, wrapping up with the traditions. What we see with the traditions are domain and hospitality granting the prince their power or praxis. Progeny and domain giving the prince rewards they can bestow and a way to control populations. The accounting, a way to ensure that new vampires remain loyal to the Camarilla. The destruction, a final sanction, and the Masquerade, a reason for the Camarilla to exist. They're the organisation globally that can cover the Masquerade. The Anarchs are perhaps a bit too disorganised on a big scale to cover the Masquerade. The Sabbat, on the face of it, don't care about the Masquerade. So the Camarilla is the organisation that everybody has to begrudgingly accept will be the organisation that maintains the Masquerade on a big scale. So thank you for joining me on another Vampire Rivals video. As ever, any questions, fire them away, pop them in the chat below, and I will leave you with a quote. This is Rudyard Kipling from The Law of the Jungle. Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky. And the world shall keep, and the wolf that keeps it may prosper, and the wolf that shall break it must die. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to chatting to you again. Goodbye.